interrupt this program to bring you...
Welcome back to Lena Makes. If you're new here, I'm Lena, and I like to make things with all different kinds of mediums, no project too big or too small, and show you the process. This week, I'm showing you how I made a resin table of one of my favorite characters, or should I say villains, from probably the creepiest cartoon on air in the late 90s, early 2000s. I started by using a Samsung tablet and an app called Concepts to sketch out what I wanted my table to look like. And then I transferred that image onto an extra piece of plywood that I had lying around in my basement. For this project, I envisioned it being a 3D table. I've seen plenty of tables where they're just flat, but I really wanted to bring out this creepy looking guy in all his creepy glory. So after I used the jigsaw to cut out the pieces, I had my boyfriend sand it down because he has a really great sander that collects all the dust and stuff. And once those two pieces were done, I moved on to painting. I primed it just using a basic white paint and primer from Home Depot. I probably should have done multiple coats because the wood kind of absorbed it, but I was being lazy. Lesson learned, don't do that. You should probably do at least 2 coats. And here's the background piece that I just painted black for now. Moving on to painting the face, I worked with the primary colors, red, green, and red, blue, and yellow to make the colors that I needed for the face, which thank goodness there were really only 3. His skin tone, his hair color, and his piercing green eyes. And in between, adding more whites to places like his eyes and his creepy grin. I lost the footage of me actually painting the skin. I am not sure where that went, but same process. After all the color was in, it's the scariest part for me, which is having a very steady hand to detail the black outline of the character. And surprisingly, at 9 p.m., I think I did a pretty good job. And by this time, I was more than done after painting for hours, so I called it a wrap and continued the next day. Off camera, my partner actually painted the background, which helped to save me some time. And from there, all we had to do was start getting into the resin process. When working with resin, you want to absolutely make sure that you have a leveled surface. I can't express how important it is to have a level surface because without it, your table's not going to come out right. We were brainstorming for a while to figure out what we should use as far as material in order to create a barrier for the resin. I made it a goal for this project to complete it without purchasing any other new materials other than what we already had on hand. So we settled on wax paper. We figured if it has a smooth enough side to not stick cookies, then it should work for resin. Yeah, it made sense at the time, so we'll see if that worked or not later in the video. Next, it was time to pour the resin. I've been using this Bee Spawn resin for a few projects now, and I do like the way it comes out, so I highly recommend. I'll leave a link in the description below if you're interested. And with epoxy resin, there are 2 parts. Your A is your resin, and your B is a hardener. You'll need to combine them in equal parts. It's helpful if you have a food scale to measure them evenly so that your mixture works. If you accidentally pour more of one than the other, then your mixture will not set properly, and unfortunately you'll have to scrap the whole project. Now, the hardest part about this is figuring out how much resin you'll actually need. I looked online and found a few resin calculators, and they all pretty much did the same thing, which was measure the area of your surface and try to calculate how much resin in like gallons you'll need. But I found that these weren't very accurate, and I ended up either with too little resin or too much resin at some point. So at this point, what you see is 2 of the measuring containers that you saw earlier in the video. So I believe that equals up to 2,000 milliliters. And I'm also using a heat gun, which if you're doing any resin project is definitely important. This is going to not only help you kind of move the resin along the area that you are working in, but when you're working with resin, there are going to be a lot of air bubbles that happen. You can try your best to be very slow, very calm, cool, and collected when working with this, but at some point, there's always going to be some type of bubbling that's going to occur. You don't have to freak out. This is where the heat gun is your best friend. You just passively move the heat gun around your area You don't want to keep it in one spot because it can burn, but you just continue to pass along your heat gun and eventually the air bubbles will go away on their own. It will take a few passes, and depending on how well also you prepped your surface, wood specifically will trap air bubbles because as you're pouring the resin, the wood itself is actually absorbing that material. So also a good thing to note, make sure it's prepped. Do the extra coats of primer, do the extra coats of paint if you need to, and you should actually do a sealing coat, just a light coat. That way it traps your colors, your paints are not going to start to merge into other colors and things like that. Now, if you're a fan of Courage the Cowardly Dog, then you're familiar with the unforgettable mixed animation styles that the show would bring to life. So I wanted to keep this table kind of as true as possible to the show by keeping the subject, which is the Freaky Fred character, 2D and flat, while incorporating a background that matches the personality and also matches the color combination. So using mica powder, and I had bought this bundle on Amazon, which I also forgot to record for you guys, but basically it is a powder that you mix in with your resin to create colors, which you saw me adding bits of silver, bits of gold, and the main background color being purple that I mixed together on my own. Now, for this project, I envisioned a psychedelic looking background, so I wanted to create some type of marbling effect. And what I did here was just take a pin from my sewing kit and just hand carved a marbling effect into the resin once I was happy with the amount of color and highlights that were in the resin. Now moving on to the next part, we waited for the background resin to almost set, that way we could place the character's head into the background and it would dry into one solid piece. This was a bit tricky, knowing our height differences. He helped me to guide this in, but I couldn't really tell the placement until it was actually within the background. So just taking my time to be very, very cautious about the placement, because knowing that as soon as it would be set down, we could not remove it again. Once we put it down, I immediately realized that the head started to shift. So I had mentioned how important it was to level your surface, and at the time it seemed like it was. I don't know what happened throughout our working, but something happened. Something shifted and something got unleveled, and the head began to shift to the left, even though our leveler indicated that it was flat. So, trial and error, we figured out that there actually was a dip on the left, and we propped it up underneath using some extra cardboard to set it correctly. Then, once it seemed like it was okay, we added some weight to it so that it wouldn't shift while it was drying. Another day and more resin. So there was actually a pretty large gap between the last time I recorded and this part of the video, because I did run out of resin, and unfortunately I did not reach my goal of not ordering more product. So I ordered the same Bee Spawn resin and continued my project. This time we didn't need any mica powder, it was just going to be clear resin because we needed to fill the gap between the background and the face. Once we had enough, which was a little less than an inch, then we would be able to do a flood coat. So similar process as before, we completely filled it and got rid of all the air bubbles. There were a lot this time, but it was okay. We did have a mix up with the heat gun, got a little too close, but we can remove that in the end process. And this is what it looked like when it's set. Now it was time to remove the wax paper.
The moment of truth. The unveiling. This is the bad side too.
After adding several layers of resin and waiting so long to take that wax paper off, I honestly didn't really have hope for it, so I really didn't know what to expect. I've read about other people using foil tape, so maybe that works. I'll have to try it in another project, but I definitely know the wax paper's not it. After a little elbow grease and finally getting the wax paper off, we then moved into the sanding process. This thing took a ton of sanding. My boyfriend whipped out the Festool again. He absolutely loves this vacuum sander, so any occasion for him to bring it out, he is more than welcome. But we started with an 80 grit and worked all the way up to a 2000. So when I tell you it took a lot of sanding, it took some hours. But finally, we had a sanded, smooth piece, and it was ready for the final pour. Once the final pour set, we flipped it around and worked on the back. These bubbles formulated around the edges once it was set, so the easiest way to remove them was to hit it with a heat gun and chisel them off. And once all those pieces were off, we sanded it again just to have a nice smooth surface and hit the back with another coat of paint and polyurethane. That way we'd have a protected surface that wouldn't chip. And once the poly was dry, it was on to final pieces. I purchased these legs on Amazon because I wanted to go with something that was clean and simple, and rather than making them myself and adding more time and labor to this project, which already took way too long for me. Honestly, this probably could have been done within a week, but it took me 3 months to get to this point. But I'm so happy with the fact that I can say this project is now complete, and oh my gosh, the final product, just look at the reveal. After blood, sweat, and tears, I can finally say I am the creator and owner of this unique Freaky Fred resin table. I'm glad I could share the process with you. Let me know what you think in the comments, and thanks for watching.